As Adam said, this week's Torah portion, Parshat Emor, lays out the Jewish calendar. We get descriptions of the first descriptions of major festivals like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. We also get the instructions to count the 50 days between Passover and Shavuot, the period of time called the Omer. We'll say that blessing in a little bit. Earlier this year, a conversion student gave me a gift on the day of the completion of her conversion process. It's something I've always wanted. It's an Omer counter. It's a laser-cut wooden circle with 50 holes, and there's a little metal pin, and each day you say the blessing, and then you move the pin to the next hole, and it's a lot of fun. For the first time in my life, I have not missed a day of counting the Omer. In part, thank you. In part because I put it on a table right in the middle of our living room, so it reminds me every day. But I'm enjoying moving the little pin. Each day, I inch it a little bit closer to slot 50 when we'll celebrate the giving of Torah and read the 10 Commandments here at Emmanuel. This year, Shavuot feels a little different, and not just because of my new Omer counting tool. Shavuot starts on sundown on June 1st and continues through the day on June 2nd. But June 2nd is not just Shavuot, but also Sine, the final day of the Texas legislative session. Any bill not passed by that day will die and need to be resurrected in another session. And just like Shavuot, the 89th Texas legislative session also prominently features the 10 Commandments. I want to talk this evening a little bit about a bill that's still ticking its way towards Sine, but still very much alive, SB 10, which would require the Christian version of the 10 Commandments be displayed in every public school classroom in the state. But before I do, I need to tell you a story. In the First Continental Congress in 1774, there was a debate about whether the proceedings should open with a prayer. John Jay and John Rutledge, who would later become the first and second Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, argued that it would be inappropriate to start with a prayerful invocation because of the religious diversity in the room. There were Episcopalians and Quakers and Presbyterians and more, and Jay and Rutledge asked how it would be possible to join together in an act of worship that was respectful of all. Sam Adams rose and said, "I am no bigot. I can hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who is at the same time a friend to his country." And he suggested the Anglican minister, Reverend Jacob Duché, who was appointed chaplain of the proceedings, and gave a prayer at the start of the very next day. Now, when this story is told, it is usually presented as one of the first debates about religious freedom in American history. On the one side of this debate were the ones who argued that government acts of religious piety were exclusionary to people of other faiths. And then there were the others who made the claim that individual acts of faith could be somehow universal. And if you tell this story this way, it would seem that Adams and the Universalists won. Except this common telling of the tale leaves out some important details. For instance, it was not an accident that Sam Adams chose an Anglican minister when he suggested Duché. As legal scholar Christopher C. Lund has explained, the Continental Congress desperately needed help integrating the revolutionary movement with the Anglican clergy and laity who would be overwhelmingly loyalist when the Revolutionary War came. Duché's selection thus was a way to move Anglican clergy into supporting the cause for liberty, or at least not opposing it so vigilantly. For Adams, then, this was not an act of religious piety, but one of political expedience. Another member of Congress, Joseph Reed, put it bluntly when he later reflected, "We never were guilty of a more masterly stroke of policy than in moving that Mr. Duché might read prayers." Policy and not piety. The common telling of this story also ignores the timing of this incident. This was 1774. These were still British colonies and subjects of the British king and the Anglican Church. It's not terribly remarkable that these colonial leaders prayed. Lexington and Concord were still 6 months away. The ratification of the Constitution and its protection for religious liberty was more than 15 years away. And this was a very minor incident. There was no prayer the next day or at any other time in that convention. In fact, it was one of only a few examples of times when these prayers were offered at any constitutional convenings. If this was an experiment in national religion, it was one the founders did not return to often. And yet there are some who love to tell this story in conversations about early American history. I think they come back to it for two reasons. One, when told simply, it appears to be a demonstration of the religiosity of the founding fathers, even if we know that the truth was much more about pragmatism than piety. And second, if it's a story about religious freedom, it's of a particular kind of religious freedom. It's the freedom to practice your religion in public spaces, even if that practice may be viewed as exclusionary by others. I was thinking about this story this week when I attended a meeting with other Houston rabbis and the Texas Education Commissioner, Mike Morath. I was there to represent Emmanuel's clergy and to ask questions about the new English language arts curriculum called the Bluebonnet curriculum. You may have heard of this referred to as the Bible-infused curriculum, and we were there to learn more about how the state had come to adopt it and what could be done in the future to ensure that state curricular materials would be developed free from religious coercion or misrepresentation. In the first grade unit on American independence, there's a painting of Reverend Duché delivering his prayer. In the teacher's guide, there's a page and a half expounding on the incident and portraying it as an example of the vocabulary word compromise. Of all the things to happen at that first constitutional convention, of all the compromises that happened there, why focus on this one? Which is the question I asked Commissioner Morath. He did not have much of an answer for me, though it is, to be fair, one image on one page of a curriculum that is more than 1,000 pages long. I would argue that the inclusion of this story intentionally overstates the religiosity of the founders and defines religious freedom as protecting the right of government officials to express their religious beliefs in public spaces. This is the same impulse behind SB 10, the bill to mandate that every classroom in the state display a copy of the Christian version of the Ten Commandments, which is currently making its way through the House of Representatives. Advocates for this bill make one of two seemingly contradictory arguments. They say either that the Ten Commandments, though they come from the Hebrew Bible, represent a universal ethical truth, or they argue that the founding fathers were uniquely influenced by the Ten Commandments, that they serve as the basis for the Constitution and subsequent American law. I'd argue they should pick a lane. Is it a universal truth or a specific inspiration? And yet this is the same ambiguity in the story of Duché's prayer. Is it a universalistic offering that should be palatable to people of all faiths, or is it a specific example of the founders' faiths? The Ten Commandments are not universal. Christians and Jews understand them differently. For Jews, I am Adonai your God is the first commandment. For Christians, it's preamble. Protestants and Catholics can't even agree on the numbering of the commandments. For Catholics, the fifth commandment warns against murder. For Protestants, it's about honoring your parents. SB 10 solves this problem creatively by listing the commandments in 12 lines and then just not numbering them at all. I hope they don't plan to use these posters to teach kids to count to 10. But it breaks my heart to think how it will feel to Jewish kids like my own to look up at posters of the Ten Commandments. Though Jews and Christians share the Hebrew Bible, our kids will know that the language on their walls is decidedly Christian. And if that's true for Jews, how much more so for Sikh kids and Hindu kids and Buddhist kids and Baha'i, for whom this text is not a part of their sacred scriptures? Will they buy the argument that the commandments are universal? The Founding Fathers didn't enshrine the Ten Commandments or any other religious text in the Constitution. They wrote instead the First Amendment, which, in Thomas Jefferson's words, builds a wall of separation of church and state. Nailing a poster of the Ten Commandments to a public school drives a crack in that wall. It should not be lost on us that the first four commandments would all be outlawed by the First Amendment. Belief in God, belief in one God, and celebration of Shabbat all violate the free exercise clause, and the commandment against taking God's name in vain contradicts freedom of speech. If the Founding Fathers wanted to protect the Ten Commandments, they did a terrible job. But they didn't want that. They wanted to protect people from religious coercion and state-sponsored religion. They wanted to move away from the state-sponsored religion of the Anglican Church, where prayer was compulsory. They wanted to honor the religious diversity of their fledgling nation. Duché's prayer is what they were having a rebellion against. SB 10 passed the Senate months ago, It currently sits in the Calendars Committee of the House of Representatives, who any day could send it to the floor for a vote. This bill is a threat to religious freedom in Texas. Our partners at RAC Texas, our statewide Reform Jewish Advocacy Project, say that now is the time to call your representative and to share your thoughts on this bill. We know that our representatives will be working through the weekend, and they could push it through at any moment. There's an attempt at play to redefine what religious freedom means in America. There's an attempt to recast the story of the Founding Fathers and promote a false narrative about the nature of the country they built. And I think our community has an important role to play in speaking up against those attempts to undermine our secular democracy. The final days of the 89th legislative session are ticking by just like the days of the Omer. Time is of the essence. When June 2nd rolls around, let the only version of the Ten Commandments we hear be the one we hear at Shavuot services.